So let's back up and think of everything that's happened over the last 48 hours in the life of the Christian church. We've celebrated the Last Supper that Jesus inaugurated with the disciples, the bread and the cup, which we will celebrate in a little bit in this worship service. We listened and learned as Jesus showed and demonstrated what true humility is when he took off his robe and put on a towel and he washed the disciples' feet, and he told us to do the same thing. And in that same night when he was finished washing their feet, Jesus gave them a new commandment that was rooted in the love that he had for them. He said to them, "As I have loved you, you must go and love other people." On a day that we call good, Jesus was betrayed. Jesus was denied. Jesus was beaten and tortured, mocked and ridiculed, and ultimately, as we know, he was crucified and he hanged on the cross. And from Friday afternoon on, when he died, Jesus lay dead in the tomb. I've often wondered what that time was first like when Jesus was dead, from Friday afternoon until that first Easter morning, throughout the entire, what we call Holy or Silent Saturday. What would that have been like? I imagine for the disciples and their families, they were not only afraid, but they were unsure. I'm certain they were worried. And more than anything else, if you were going to sum up what was going on with them, you could probably do so with one word: grief. Back in 1969, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a groundbreaking book called On Death and Dying, and in it, maybe you're familiar with the 5 stages of grief that she hypothesized: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When she first proposed this idea of these 5 stages, she said these stages are linear. That is to say, once we encounter denial, we work through it and then move on to the next stage, anger, and then from anger to bargaining and so on. Later, she revised it and said, the stages of grief aren't linear. They're not something to be worked through. They're something we live in. And she said, the stages of grief are cyclical. In other words, you can be at the 4th stage of grief, depression, and suddenly find yourself back at the 1st stage, denial. We all know that that makes sense, because I'm going to venture a guess that everybody who's here on this Easter morning has experienced the crushing and devastating sense of grief in life. Amid that grief, it's Mary Magdalene who goes to the tomb. She shows up and the stone has been rolled away. I make it a yearly habit to go visit my grandparents' graves in Coopersville and Muskegon, Michigan. And I have to tell you, if I went there and I saw either of their headstones knocked over, I too would be upset. But here, Jesus has just died, and Mary recognizes that the stone has been rolled away. Jesus isn't there. And she does what anybody does. She runs back and tells the disciples. The disciples, mind you, are sitting alone, sequestered from everything that's happened in the last few days. And when Mary tells them, this is what has happened, that got their attention. It rocked them out of their sense of being dumbfounded by everything that had gone on. And so we're told that Peter and John literally ran to the tomb. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, he looks into the tomb, but he doesn't go in the tomb. Peter, no big surprise, he looks in and he goes in, and then John follows suit. We're told that both of them came to the same conclusion. They believed, but they didn't understand. They knew that Jesus had died, but they didn't understand the implications of the resurrection. And so we're told in verse 10 that the disciples returned to their homes. They were going to go back to their former way of living. They were going to go back to life as it had been before Jesus. Now, we can kind of be like that too. Think about it. Sometimes we think God's not acting quickly enough for us. We say, God won't do this for me, for us, and so we go back to what's known. We return to what or who is familiar. Or, on the flip side of that, God calls us to do something or to be someone, and we're like Bartleby the Scrivener. I'd prefer not to. I'm comfortable the way I am. I'm just fine with who I am. Thankfully, God continually pursues us for good and goodness. Mary is despondent, there's no doubt about that, but she, to her credit, will not leave the tomb. Through resolute tears, she sees two angels, and they ask her the obvious question, why are you crying? Why the grief? Why the weeping? And she says, because they've taken my Lord away, and I don't know what they've done with him. Before Mary could finish having any sort of meaningful conversation with these two angels who were inside the tomb, they were gone. And the next thing we know, Jesus saw a man. Now we know from reading the story this morning that the man that Mary sees is Jesus. Mary doesn't recognize that it's Jesus. And this man asks Mary the same question, why are you weeping? And all Mary can muster is, if you know where he is, please take me to him. Now you know about good stories. Every good one has the essentials, characters that you're drawn to, a plot that you get drawn into, and then conflict that keeps building and building. When you have that in a story, it grabs a hold of us. And then when the tension is so thick, we end up saying to ourselves, come on already, come on, get to the resolution. And finally this morning, the resolution, Jesus said only one word to Mary, one word, her name, Mary. And in that instance, and in that moment, it was God's great reversal. Rabboni, teacher. In that moment, it was God's great reversal. Christ is alive. Mary realized she is now alive. We say we're alive, and it's unfettered joy. And what happens? Mary becomes the first evangelist, the first one to say that Jesus has been raised from the dead. In these last few verses of our reading from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gets to be a little bit autobiographical. He says towards the last remaining verses that first he was unfit to be who God called him and claimed him to be. What he's saying is that he was fully and wholly unworthy to be this person that God redeemed. He thought this because he said, I used to persecute the church. I used to find families and I'd tear them apart. I'd take a brother or a father or a sister or a mother and I'd arrest them and I'd throw them in prison. I used to persecute the church. I beat people who worshiped Jesus, who said that Christ is Lord. I persecuted the church. People who worshiped this God, I threw them in prison. And then what happened? God's great reversal. Saul of Tarsus, now Paul, the apostle, the evangelist to the Gentiles. And from that time on, from the time that God claimed his life, from the time that God called Saul and said, now you're going to be Paul and you're going to proclaim the gospel to the apostles or to the Gentiles, that's exactly what Paul did. He preached anywhere and everywhere. He wrote, he encouraged, he taught. And time again, over 53 times in the letters he wrote, he said one thing, Christ has been risen. Paul, in his life, living proof of the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Like Mary, Paul became an evangelist. He traveled, he proclaimed it. He even said in one of his letters to the church in Corinth, kind of tongue-in-cheek, he said, we're fools for Christ. And when he said that, he was maybe channeling Ebenezer Scrooge, or maybe Dickens was channeling Paul when he wrote that Ebenezer Scrooge, on the day he awoke after the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future had visited him, Scrooge realized that he had been born again and he was happy as an angel, giddy as a drunken man, merry as a schoolboy. He was new. God's great reversal had taken effect. Now, it wasn't always a picnic for Paul. He would be beaten. He would be whipped. He would be thrown in jail. He'd be hungry. He'd be tired. He'd be naked. He'd be shipwrecked. And there were times that Paul went to God and said, "Why?" And there were other times he went to the Lord and said, "How long?" And God said, "Everything's going to be okay because my grace will suffice for you, Paul." It's Easter Sunday, the high mark of the Christian calendar, and the task of any pastor, any preacher worth his or her salt is simple. Just proclaim the gospel. And it's simple too. Jesus Christ is risen. Maybe you know that. Maybe you don't, and you're investigating what that might mean for you in your life. Maybe you're here because someone dragged you along against your own desires. For whatever reason you're here, I'm glad you're here. I admit, I don't fully understand the complete impact of the resurrection. I know what I learned in grad school at Western Theological Seminary, that Jesus dying and being raised from the dead conquered sin and destroyed death from the inside out. And I believe that and I trust that. But sometimes I'm still like Peter and John. I want to peek in that tomb, and I want to know, is it really empty? And I want to know, what does it mean? What else does it mean? What's new about the resurrection this year? Is the resurrection relevant in 2018? Well, I think it is. For one thing, God's great reversal means that God's people no longer need to live in fear. There are times we are afraid. That's normal. It's natural. It's part of what it means to live in the human condition. But we don't have to live in fear. We're freed to live a new life. We're freed to live a life that serves the risen Jesus Christ by serving other people first. Early on in Matthew's gospel, long before we get to Holy Week, there's a marvelous story where Jesus learns that John the Baptist, who is his cousin, has been murdered by King Herod. John the Baptist literally was beheaded. And as you can imagine, the followers of John the Baptist, they're like the 12 and Mary and the others. They're stunned. They're shocked. Their leader is dead. Now what? And the Bible says a beautiful thing. It says Jesus saw these people who had been followers of John the Baptist, and it says Jesus looked at them and realized they were like sheep without a shepherd, and so Jesus had compassion on them. Jesus entered into their lives when everything in their world was upside down. Jesus went in when everything was unbearable and falling apart. Jesus suffered with them. Jesus grieved alongside them. Jesus took God's mercy and made it visible and tangible and present. I think that's one of the calls for the Christian church, is to reveal the mercy of God. We're God's people, and every day we need to make visible God's mercy, make it tangible, make it present in other people's lives. One of the calls of the church is to be a witness to God's great reversal, and into death, breathe life, and out of despair, proclaim hope. And in misery, bring compassion, and from oppression, act for justice, and to gather all of the isms of the world and bring unity. Do you know the name Gerard Manley Hopkins? He was a 19th century Jesuit priest and a poet extraordinaire. And one of his more well-known poems is called The Wreck of the Deutschland. It was written in memory of 5 nuns who had been exiled, and in their exile they drowned on a ship. Hopkins was not only a priest and a poet, but he was also a master of the English language, and he does something remarkable in this poem. One of the lines in this poem is this: "Let Christ Easter in us." He takes the noun Easter and he changes it into a verb, much in the same way of Melissa's marvelous prayer, practice resurrection. Let Christ Easter in us. In other words, we don't have to live in fear any longer. We don't have to live with worry. Because Jesus has been raised, we're being formed and changed. Because Christ is Eastering in us, we can go and practice resurrection in the world. Because Jesus has been raised, what the future hope is now a present reality. I hope you loved watching the children lead us in worship this morning as they sang that marvelous little song, "Every Morning is Easter Morning." I sang that growing up at Garden Crest Presbyterian Church in St. Pete, and so it has special memories for me. But like that song says, Jesus is alive. So it's not up to us. We no longer have to say, well, I've got to, or if it's going to be, it's up to me. God's great reversal says, it has been done, and it is being done in the resurrected and the living Christ. Friends, God's great reversal, which we celebrate today and which Christians celebrate the entire year round, obviously it's proclamation. It's simple. The Lord is risen, and that in and of itself should be the end of the story. And as a matter of fact, later on in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says if Jesus hasn't been risen, well then none of this has any point to it. But the great reversal that God gives to us is also an invitation. So after we dry our tears, and after we ask the questions that we want answered, and after we do a little bit of our own investigating, it's an invitation to live life in a new way, to live a life where death no longer reigns, and to live a life where you get to take the resurrection home with you from this place for the rest of your life. To God be the glory, because the Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen.